Hey everybody, welcome to the Rapcast. I'm Samson Folk. Whether you're on the podcast channel or the YouTube channel, welcome. This is another episode of Outside Looking In, which is the series wherein we get somebody from another market who covers another team, talk about their team, and then at the same time, talk about the Raptors so you can learn about the league at large, and we can build a consensus on how the Raptors are viewed worldwide. And today, Joe Hulbert, who is a guru of X's and O's on Twitter at Joe Hulbert NBA, of course, but we'll also have Timberwolves content for you this upcoming season at Canis Hoopus, the SB Nation Timberwolves site. Joe, how the hell are you, man?
Yeah, really well. I'm looking forward to this. Actually, it's two interesting teams. How are you doing yourself?
I'm doing fine. Listener, if you're picking up on that, that is an English accent. Don't be fooled. Joe just does it for the views, by the way, just so you're more amenable to his I guess suggestions in the basketball verse. But the first thing I want to ask you, broad strokes. You're over in England and you like the Wolves and you like quite a few other teams, but the Raptors are a team that you've been catching up on. What do you think of that team? Broad strokes. It's the Raptors. Your Cliff Notes version of it.
Yeah, so the first thing I'll say, on the Raptors before I dive into basketball, they have a lot of fans over in the UK, man. I'd say they're probably like a top three team people follow. They got a
Wow.
really good and loyal UK fan base. So they're usually picked for games that are on TV because they know that some of the fiends like myself, but all the Raptors fans will stay up and watch it, whereas they won't for other teams. With regards to the team, like the main thing I love about the Raptors, and this is something that I kind of noticed a lot of when I sort of took a little bit of time away at times this year, was like a lot of teams in the NBA were kind of doing the same thing. It was like they're going to switch hunt in the first 5 seconds of the shot clock, and then it's just kind of go to work. I like how the Raptors do things a little bit differently. Like you've got an extremely aggressive defense, just there's a very different philosophy there. They're not just trying to copy the run of the mill game plan that everyone else is doing. So in terms of the build up on the roster, I mean Pascal Siakam. I know we've talked about Anthony Edwards, and I'm sure we'll talk about him later. But I think Pascal's become very over criticized in the last, I'd say, sort of 18 months, 2 years. I call it like overcorrection because I think there's sometimes you get a sense that a certain group is overrating a player. I don't think he was being overrated, but I think when people see that, they try and fight back, but they go too far the other way. And I think Pascal, I watched your episode with Jackson. I'm in agreement with Jackson that he's like a top 15, top 10 guy in the league. I love watching him. He was one of the first players who really shaped my overall basketball philosophy because at the time he sort of burst onto the scene, a lot of teams were just going small all the time. And then hang on a minute, the Raptors are trotting out a 6'10", 6'11" 4 with Marc Gasol at center as well. They went big, and Pascal was just cooking these small ball fours, man, because they were. It wasn't even just in the post; they just could not deal with him. And I thought he was a very unique kind of chess piece, that's the main thing I've loved about the Raptors.
The chess aspect, definitely. I should bring Louis Zatzman on. I did minute basketball with him, and he loves chess as well. There's actually an interesting correlation between a lot of people on NBA Twitter who have very niche interests in teams and stuff like that, also being extremely good at chess. Mind you, chess is a really popular game, so maybe it's not that insane. But okay, so Pascal Siakam helps form your idea of basketball and kind of understanding it through a certain lens. OG Anunoby, I guess I'd ask, because he's a guy who sometimes has a British accent when he's in the UK being interviewed and stuff like that. It comes out. Then he doesn't have it when he's in America or Canada. But a guy like a countryman, technically, what are your thoughts on OG Anunoby?
You know what? He's done a lot to sort of. He's partially, I think, the reason that there are a lot of Raptors fans in the UK. Because, when I first started getting into the NBA in 2011, the first thing I did as a Brit looking at American sport, I said, well, who are the British players in the NBA? And at the time, there were two. It was Luol Deng
Mm-hmm.
and Joel Freeland, who used to play for the Portland Trail Blazers. And I think, the job he's done to grow the game in this country is just amazing. And he fits into that sort of unique philosophy that I told you about. But he always comes across very well when he's interviewed about the game in the UK. There's other athletes in different sports who they almost get a little bit offended if you try and ask them about the growth of the game in the UK. When it's a big part of it because it's a very niche interest and there's a lot of people because like over here, right, if you're growing up, you're playing football or rugby or cricket, right? Those are your sports. And I think people who maybe are into basketball, they'll look up to a guy like OG. And I think that's the side of the game that I want to try and bring kind of more attention to because I think he's an inspiration for a lot of these kids.
Actually, if we could take just a moment, we'll get to the Wolves right after this. But since you're in such a unique position as somebody who covers the NBA from the UK, where basketball is desperately trying to find its foothold there, and you're somebody who knows a lot about the game, if you could just walk me through kind of the growth you've seen in basketball, if any, over your time being interested in it over there.
Yeah, so it is definitely growing on a grassroots level. And what I mean by that is 10 years ago, if I walked down a UK street, even in a busy city, because I kind of live in the suburbs, so people's interests are a bit more, straight line. But if you go into Bristol now, you're going to see jerseys, hats, gear. You've got people wearing some shoes as well. Like there's that. I think that shoe culture helped. I think The Last Dance really helped as well because that came out right when we went into lockdown. And people were watching that because they had nothing else better to do, really. And like that, people were like, actually, this is pretty cool. So that's definitely helped grow the game. The problem we have in the UK actually getting people to play it is it's a very complex problem that a lot of people have kind of picked up on, but the government don't fund basketball at any level. So they'll fund things like dressage, all those like very even more niche sports because the dressage has its place, of course, but there's not like a national dressage league that's where players are earning $200 million in their contracts. Like it's kind of frustrating to me because the game has so much potential to grow further and people are enjoying it, but it's almost like the government aren't funding it. They're closing down gyms. I think I've heard some stuff in London where they're actually like covering basketball hoops because they don't want people playing it. I don't quite know what the thinking there is, but it's like it is really nice to see it growing. Obviously, there's not a lot of people who are covering it. There's Tom West who does a really good job over at Liberty Ballers. Hugh Hopkins as well. There's like a couple of guys who really cover it, but it's been really nice to see it grow. But I think the next step is getting people to play it, and that's kind of where it gets a bit frustrating to me.
That's tough, and especially since it's a complex game as well. There's a lot of really specific movements that you have to master to get good at basketball.
But it gets you good at other sports as well. Like a lot of my analysis, I'll be bringing football into it a bit later for one of my kind of theories about schemes and stuff. It's like there are definitely similarities, and if you talk to a lot of high level athletes, they will watch other sports. I mean, and coaches as well, like Pep Guardiola, when he was at Bayern Munich, because they have a basketball team, he was like fascinated by their basketball team because it taught him about his own sport. Like there's so many. It makes us better at other sports, but they're trying to hide it to fund the more middle class, upper class sports. It's definitely an issue.
I was going to ask you because I talked about this with the episode isn't released yet, but with Joe Virai, who covers the Warriors, Blind Pig. Do you think that Blind Pig is from somebody who was watching soccer, like switch the play through ball type action and thought, let's just put that into basketball?
Yeah, I do, because one of the ways that through balls are freed up is I don't know the correct terminology, but a lot of the ways you kind of free up a through ball is you actually have someone drop deep as the ball is being played. You'll see it a lot on set pieces as well, where like if there's a set piece from deep, someone will be stood like 5 yards offside and they'll drop back in. The defense are like, what the hell? And then that kind of confuses them. So I definitely can see the influence there for sure, man.
Okay, so dropping my fascination with the UK and how basketball are intertwined, the Wolves, they trade for Rudy Gobert. They have D'Lo on the roster, who I think is probably largely underrated at this point in the NBA. They have Karl Anthony Towns, an all NBA big man. They have Anthony Edwards, the coolest athlete in the world, maybe, just an awesome dude. And they have a bunch of other players, some really interesting guys like Naz Reid and Jalen Noel, who I think, man, if they had bigger roles on other teams, maybe there's a route to like starter, high level starter careers for them. Who knows how it shakes out? But should we be looking at this Timberwolves team in that contender tier? I'm curious what you think about that.
Yeah, this was of the sort of questions, boys, you gave. This was the toughest one to answer because, like, I'm not looking at them as a title contender, and I don't even know if Tim Connolly and Chris Finch are right now because I think they need some internal jumps. But like, I imagine we're approaching the preseason. People are going to be doing their predictions for the standings, who makes the conference finals. People even whack brackets out in September. You know what I mean? And like, I think it's at a point with the Wolves. Like, if someone puts them in the conference finals, I'm not going to argue with it. It's not where I would have it. I think the Espeted, they have to win a first round series this year, barring like, you know, a horrific injury crisis or something. But like, I spoke about the Raptors doing things unique. The reason I believe in this Wolves team is because I think they're playing in a way that I've not seen a big man pairing like this, to be quite honest. I know we've had the great big man duos of the past, but where I'm at with this team is like Rudy is a Hall of Fame defender, could win Depoy again. And then you've got Cat, who like Cat is the best shooting big man of all time. I know there's going to be people saying Dirk, but if you actually look at the numbers, it is Cat. And it's a different game. Cat is definitely better off the movement as well. Obviously, Dirk was a greater player, but you know where I'm at with that. Like the way teams attacked, because when I look at contenders, because I know I deep dive into the X's and O's quite a lot, but I kind of look at the absolute basic of kind of, if this team does this coverage against your best lineup, what do you do? And the thing that killed the Wolves last year was that teams would send a double, a blitz, or whatever at Cat. And, you know, I love Jared Vanderbilt, by the way. He's incredible, but like, he is a non-threat on offense. He's not got the best hands. If you double Cat in the low block, you can't help off of Rudy Gobert because he's 7 foot, and Cat's a good passer. He's really improved that, and I think that's the best skill. So I look at this team and I just see an insane amount of potential in that what they're doing, other teams might not necessarily have the counters to, and other teams certainly won't be doing it because that big man pairing, though all of Gobert's offense is scheme generally, he's not really a post-up guy or someone who's going to attack off the dribble. That is a scary pairing for me. But the questions probably come more in the backcourt and people's evaluation of those guys.
You bringing up the passing, I think, is really interesting because Cat has frustrated people at times, for sure, on some of the reads he made, especially against heavy pressure. But also he's been fantastical at times too, and just finding that consistent middle ground has been a huge part of his ascension. I'm also really interested about, you know, Kyle Lowry, Raptors fans will be really familiar with seeing the ball squirt out of like a double or something. Maybe DeMar gets doubled on the block after posting up a small guard. If that ball comes to Kyle Lowry, as the defense attempts to catch up, some players kind of get into a reset because they can't make the read. They don't see where the defense is going. They can't find the guy. But Kyle Lowry was a player who could shift the defense back over to the strong side, back over to the weak side, then find the duck in on the strong side. Like against these moving defenses, could find it. And D'Angelo Russell, I suspect, will be really, really great at not only directing the ball after it, you know, if he's above the break, it squirts out to him, not only finding guys on the perimeter, but also that might be a laser beam of a lob to, you know, Rudy or something like that. I think there's a lot of potential. The thing that would keep them from being contenders, though, limitations. I'm curious what you view those as.
I think down the stretch, half court offense could be an issue. Like with this pairing, I'm more worried about the offense than the defense. And I think some of that, like I'll hold my hands up there, is like the way I view the game. I'm the type, if I'm playing like out of the park and I've got my team fourth in runs and 30th in runs against, I'm like, oh, I need more offense, right? I definitely sway more towards that side, but I think like half court speed could be a problem for this team. And I think that the key for me is finding the right fifth starter, because there are a lot of options there, which is good. It's better to have that than no options. But obviously, you're going to have Cat, Gobert, Anthony Edwards, and D'Lo. I think your options for the other one. I mean, I think Austin Rivers has a chance to start for this team, whether he finishes games. But you put Jaden in there at 3, and I mean, he is an incredible defender, man. He is right in that top tier for me. Like, the things he can do, his recovery speed. If he makes a mistake, I kind of know he's got a chance to recover, which I think is a skill in itself. Obviously, you'd rather they didn't make the mistake, but they're not robots. No player's never going to make a mistake. Recovery speed is important. So the limitation for me, it's all hypothetical questions. It's kind of like the fifth starter. What is the half-court offense going to look like? Like, is it going to get a bit stagnant with the two big men? I hope it doesn't, because Cat is someone that theoretically, teams are going to have to hard press on Cat. We played the Spurs last year. It was I think Cat dropped his career high, and they had like Jakob Poeltl doing soft closeouts on Cat. I mean, it's no surprise he went for his career high, man. Like, you have to worry about that, but it's how the other players fit in that definitely, I wouldn't say it concerns me, but that's what I'm looking at.
That makes a lot of sense. The Rivers point is not one I would have went to, but especially since you added the caveat, like not necessarily closing games, I can see the wisdom in that, especially just to get, if the simplicity of his skill set makes things run a bit smoother to start things out, then I get that. But there's also that ceiling. McDaniels, it's a tragedy among Raptors fans because he was selected 1 pick before Malachi Flynn. And then you imagine it just so happens that the Raptors are running the scheme that McDaniels would fit into maybe best in the NBA. I'm still hurt about it, but he blows my mind. There's also some burgeoning on-ball stuff and finishing stuff with McDaniels that I'm interested in offensively. But yeah, it's not as glove in hand in glove. Jesus, it's not as hand in glove as maybe Rivers, just because of skill set. That really interests me. The interesting thing, so not only are you and Caitlin Cooper both, very, very familiar with X's and O's and stuff like that, so you get to come and tell us about set actions on these episodes, but when I talked to Caitlin, we got to reference the Indiana Raptors. Nate Bjorkgren went to Indiana and took a large portion of the Raptors playbook with him. Chris Finch was an assistant coach with the Raptors for about half a season. They started running quite a few different, variations of horns, some other sets that Chris Finch was, he wanted to run these. And so the Raptors and the Wolves share a portion of a playbook now. And so it's not the Minnesota Raptors. It doesn't have to be so Raptor centric, but I'm curious what overlap you see between the two teams.
Yeah, that's a great question, because like the thing with Finch is he has coached like he's been with like Alvin Gentry as well. I want to say he was on the Rockets too. Like he's been around the block. The main similarity I see is definitely the defensive, I guess, versatility, aggressiveness. You could use either of those words. I think Finch is. It's hard to say, because the Raptors have really drafted for Nurse's philosophy, I think. Whereas the Wolves, this is now really their first settled roster. So it's going to be interesting what it looks like. But Finch and Nurse are both similar to me in the sense they think outside the box. I said earlier that they don't just run the same sets that the contenders run. They're like, no, they think outside the box, man. And I think, and on that defensive aggressiveness, like I think towards the end of the season, the Wolves players were gassed from running those blitzes, because it's hard. It's really difficult. I will say we have a very deep roster this year, the Wolves. Like that will help a lot more, I think. But with regards to like Finchie, I think he's the best thing to happen to the Timberwolves for a very long time. He's very good. I think he learned off Nurse in the sense that like you have to be able to blitz your coverages. And I think as well, like I remember reading, I think it was Blake Murphy wrote a piece about how the Raptors allow corner threes on purpose. Am I right in that? I think there's a couple.
The term is democratic rim protection, coined by our pal Hank Ward, wherein the Raptors pull off of the strong side corner to
Yeah,
send more help at the rim and create higher pickup points for people who are driving. And they have the highest frequency of corner three-pointers in the NBA by far.
and that's the thing for me. I think Finch and Nurse both accept that, like, with the modern NBA, with all the offensive greatness we have, you can't defend everything. I know we like to think we can, but you kind of have to allow something because these guys are so good. These coaches are so creative. They're watching film from, Europe where a lot of these creative offensive concepts on like the Basketball Action Dictionary, a lot of them originate from European basketball, man. Like there's so much you can do. And I think Finch is definitely like of that school where he's like, we need to mix things up. We can't just because I know there is definitely an agenda against drop coverage on NBA Twitter, but I can tell you as a guy who's just watched the Charlotte Hornets back, knowing a trap is coming is arguably worse because teams against the Hornets, they knew this trap was coming and they knew that if they just made a certain step back, they either had an open roller or they just throw a little pass to someone lifting from the corner. Like it's that defensive creativity and that defensive mix that I think I really like about Finch, and that's where I see the Nurse influence.
What the point you make about drop, salient. Over these past few years in the NBA, I have no idea. I think it's because people view the highest peak of basketball as not drop defense. So they think that just strive for the highest. But drop defense can allow for a very, very strong defense. And, of course, every team that wins has to have scheme versatility. But the Lakers and the Bucks and the Raptors, 3 years in a row, all of those teams ran drop a large percentage of the time. And it was really interesting to see during those years, everybody said drop doesn't work. And 3 champions in a row played an immense amount of drop. What you said about playing similarly defensively, I was doing an episode of the now defunct Bouncing Around podcast, and we were doing my game of the week was the Timberwolves. And I remember watching McDaniels and Okogie flying around, and I sat there and I said, this looks quite familiar to something I saw in Toronto. So I'm glad you mentioned that. There are definitely similarities as far as what they're doing defensively. Are there any pet plays? I know you're always running through the Timberwolves film to find like maybe it's an ATO, maybe it's a sidelines out of bounds play, right? So, well, those can be the same thing. But you're constantly cataloging interesting set plays. And is there anything that you think is, and we'll put the film on screen for anybody watching, but are there any plays that you find extremely interesting in what advantage they create for the Timberwolves?
So Chris Finch's out of bounds plays they're really, really good. I've put one on my timeline, which I'm happy to link you again, which is just like basically your point guard pops to the corner. So you have your best shooter inbound. So it's Malik Beasley this year. Imagine this year it's going to be Bryn Forbes, although I don't know if he's quite as maybe comfortable as a passer, but he's going to have to be because someone has to run those sets. But you'll pitch it to the point guard in the corner, and you have this little exchange between the point guard and the center, and it looks like that the point guard is going to set kind of like some kind of a back screen for the big. Then he just pops to the corner. Obviously, if he's open, you take that, but normally he's not. And then Beasley, after he's passed the ball to him, is going to pop, and he's actually going to flare to the top of the screen. That's a really good one. Finch generally is extremely. The thing I like that Finch does, and I will link you a play on this. I'm actually going to do a video on it as well, but it's a play where he will have the best shooter on the court set a wedge screen for Cat, and then he will actually curl into the paint, and then he will come out on an exit screen. I really like that because I think too many teams over the years, like when they run stuff for their shooters, it's really obvious. Like I used to cover the Miami Heat before they were good, to be quite honest. And Wayne Ellington was like their most important player, but it was it on offense, like he was. It sounds weird to say that, but when they were running stuff for him, it was kind of so obvious. But then when Bam started to develop, it was like, oh, hang on a minute, we can have these little slips to the rim off of these. But what Finch does really well is he links his offense together. He puts his two most important players in an action that can have two outcomes rather than one. And I think that is so important. And like on the Raptors, that's what I want to see more of from the Raptors. You know, I want to see more of that because I think it can get a little bit rigid and stagnant in there.
It's such a great point. When I was doing that bouncing around episode, it's just something as simple as horns out, that maybe it's a shot for Anthony Edwards, maybe he gets a closeout to attack, or you just filter into an Ant plus Cat pick and roll. That's in the NBA, having incredibly potent two-man actions is basically the lifeblood of most offenses. It's not always that simple, but having a two-man action that can break the convention of defense is really great. And the Wolves have that packaged in, especially as, you know, as you say, like, is there a big man duo that's reminiscent of Cat and Rudy Gobert? The closest probably is like Dirk and Tyson Chandler. And even then, that's not close. That's like the foggiest idea of two silhouettes, you know? And to have a guy like Cat and D'Lo and, you know, well, you know, who knows who it ends up being, but maybe it's Cat, D'Lo, and Ant in like these three-man actions like horns, and you can just run tons of stuff. You can use D'Lo as a screener, and he can pop out if people overhelp. You know, Ant on the move, especially as he learns to kind of draw more fouls next year, probably too. It's just, it's a lot of offensive pop. That's not something that, at least I don't think, the Raptors and the Wolves share that in common. As good as you know, like a Fred VanVleet is the ghost screener and Pascal Siakam is on ball, that can be a great little two-man action, but it's just they don't have the wealth of offensive options that the Wolves have. I guess we'll see what happens with Scotty, but that would be quite a leap to get to where you could consider that threesome versus the threesome in Minnesota. But yeah, that's really interesting. The other thing I want to ask you about is hierarchy, because there are people who correctly, anytime a big man is the leader or the best player on an offense, everybody constantly asks questions about the hierarchy of decision making, right? We've seen it discussed in many different dialogues across many different teams. And Karl-Anthony Towns, you know, with him being the focal point of an offense, since he's a big man, can get frozen out at times because just the conventions of the NBA, who handles the ball, how teams overload, you can freeze out a big man easier than you can freeze out a guard typically. I'm curious if you have an ideal hierarchy, because maybe it's not intuitive for most people to look at the Wolves and say, this guy, this guy, this guy, this guy. But if you believe in hierarchies, maybe you do, maybe you don't. What is the kind of situation you'd like to see play out in Minnesota, if that question makes sense to you?
No, it absolutely does. And it's generally like the reason a guard's harder to freeze out is because they're the ones who bring the ball up, you know, and it's especially with guys like Trae Young, like the moment they cross half court, they're a threat. Like people are guarding Trae Young, honestly, even before he crosses half court, which is quite wild sometimes. But on that front, I think this is where Gobert helps in the hierarchy. It's harder to freeze Cat out of the game because generally to freeze Cat out of a game, you're having to aggressively front. If he gets the ball, especially on that low block, Finch likes putting him on the left side of the court, because then he can pass with his right hand. It's little things like that Finch did that Thibodeau and Saunders definitely didn't. But I think that's where Gobert helps, because I know it's a little bit simplistic, but I think in terms of analyzing a hierarchy, I think it has to be quite simplistic. So like we spoke about the Cavs the other day, for example, and it's like last year, if you trapped Darius Garland, you shut down their offense. So that's why they went and got Donovan Mitchell. Now, if you send something at Cat, okay, well, we've got willing passers on the perimeter, especially D'Lo. He's not an elite playmaker, but he's a very good passer. You know, he sees things, in my opinion, pretty quickly, even if necessarily his body can't keep up with it because he doesn't have a lot of burst. But like that low man, high man pass to Rudy Gobert. Like that, I think that is what I envision as part of the hierarchy. Because this is the first time I think I want to say in the Timberwolves era where he has actually had a real low down threat. We had Taj Gibson for a couple of years under Thibs. I know everyone laughs at Taj Gibson, like, oh, it's Thibodeau's guy. Taj was good for the Timberwolves, but his thing was kind of more like ceiling in the post. And also, Thibs' offense isn't very creative, so that's really all it was. But like now, he has got someone who can not necessarily take the load off of him, but he can punish the types of coverage that take out of the equation.
He's
Finch,
a proper release valve. Yeah.
he is, and I think Finch also loves running. I think we're going to see a lot more delay this year, possibly with Rudy at the top of the key. We didn't see a lot of delay last year unless Naz Reid was in the game because he is just extremely fluid. But I think the actions Finch runs, like for me, as someone who studies across the league, I would have Finch like top 2 or 3 in offenses X's and O's. Like Quinn Snyder was just the god of X's and O's, but like next to that, Finch is right there. And I think we're going to see a lot of pistol this year. I don't know if pistol has to be guard to guard, but we've run those outlines before with Reed and Cat as the guys ready to receive the ball, and it's just like there's so much potential. But when it comes down to a gritty half-court possession, a lot of the stuff people do to take Cat out can and will be punished. That's the way I see it.
The Raptors love, like, early offense pistol is a staple of some of the Raptors looks as well, especially since they're so wingy. I was going to ask you, because you brought up D'Lo, playmaker versus passer, a distinction I love, Joe. The passing skill, if you want to divorce from playmaking, you can have that conversation. And being a playmaker is all about creating advantages mostly, because you can't just passing skill your way to success. You have to compromise the defense at certain points. But the point you make about D'Lo being just an elite passer, finding like little, pockets and windows of to pass into, that's great. And then the limits on playmaking a little bit, that makes sense as well. And then, yeah, the ILO stuff, I can't wait to see it. Another thing I want to ask you, though, considering the Wolves, is they have guys like Naz Reid, who, Sports Info Solutions, SIS, put out this great metric where you see guys like Naz Reid are elite at maintaining advantages. They make good decisions, as you said, fluid decision-making, fluid on ball. They have a guy like Naz Reid. They have a guy like Jalen Noel, who, if you go by as far as how he creates his own shot, getting to the rim, his jumper, points per shot attempt, all that kind of stuff, is also a darling. I'm curious what you think the back end of the Wolves looks like, that second unit. What type of, maybe there's no difference in the type of offense they play, but who do you expect to lead those types of lineups?
Yeah, the bench is going to be really nice. I think like Noel and McLaughlin are the first players I look at. Like McLaughlin, there was a period where Wolves fans like thought he was going to get cut. I didn't really understand it myself. Like he's not perfect, but he is a good backup guard. They run him through the offense as well. They run him on a play called Spurs backdoor, which I believe it's usually out of a pistol alignment where he will just pitch it to Cat or Reed or whoever it is, someone with real offensive prowess, and he just cuts to the rim. And it looks so simple. And I'm shouting on my TV going, how the hell does that work? Because it's just a guy moving to the rim. There's nothing creative, but like J-Mac and Noel, that's a nice bench backcourt. You've got, I looked at some of like Naz's lineup minutes, like his minutes last year. He didn't play a lot with Cat, but he did play a lot with Gobert. So like when I saw he wasn't playing with Cat, I was a little bit worried. Like, is he going to get frozen out? But I think the thing with Naz is that the reason I love that metric is because people would look at a Naz Reid, Jared Vanderbilt pairing from last year and go, well, neither of them are great shooters. That's not going to work. But Naz, it's not that simple. Spacing is a continuous thing. And with how fluid and quick Naz Reid is, especially as a decision maker, like he's one of those that fits into the category. He may not make the right decision every time, but if he makes a wrong one, he's going to make it quickly. So the offense can flow back into something else, if that makes sense. he's just it's a bit selfish of me because I feel bad that he's like the third center on this team. I think he's good enough to start somewhere. I think he's a really fun player. I think he's brilliant. And then we got Taurean Prince, who I didn't love the signing, but he was relatively good last year. Austin Rivers as well.
Kyle Anderson. Wow.
Loma,
He's
my God, I
great.
forgot him.
Yeah.
That's
He's
bad.
great.
Yeah, he's probably going to be like the lead guy. I can't wait to see how Finch meshes him with the rest of the starters. To be honest, like how's that going to look? Because you could theoretically play. I mean, I don't like to look at basketball as theoretical, but if we're talking about a lineup that like would be fun to me, it would be like Ant, Slow-Mo, Jaden, Rudy, and Cat. Like I know it's not the quickest lineup, but like the size, the passing, the playmaking, the things you can do with that. Like Slow-Mo is going to be a dream player for Finch. I could see him using him as a lot as like a second screener, and then he'll pop and flow into another action. I think that's something Finch really likes to do.
Mm-hmm. That's connective stuff. Slow-Mo has been great everywhere, basically, especially with coaches that feel inclined to use him properly. He was a dream, man. In with the Grizzlies, whether it was like linking up with Ja or linking up with Jonas when he was still there was just so much that they were able to do that I think was awesome. Back to the Raptors though. We've discussed a little bit about the Raptors, but mostly the Wolves on this, which is good. There's 29 episodes for people to hear about the Raptors and only one about the Wolves. But I'm curious, we talked a little bit about OG, a little bit about Pascal, and the overall scheme, play style that the Raptors are trying to achieve. But is there anything else among that team that interests you?
I think the thing that interests me is when I watch this team, I find myself trying to solve the offensive scheme, and they bring up a really interesting question for me. Is like because I'm watching a lot of this film, and I've got all these plays in my head, and like I kind of think to myself, do these plays work without a roll man? That's kind of what's been coming back to me. So I was thinking of delay, for example. Like Rick Carlisle for me is the delay king. Like I'm gonna write one day. I'll write an article on delay and how everyone runs it. But a lot of the counters that Rick would run out of delay involve Dwight Powell, who isn't. I mean, he's not great at anything else, but he's a great role man. Okay, so like, I just look at this Raptors team and I'm like, I want to be critical at them for the X's and O's because it can be a little bit bland. There is some good stuff, like you'll know this play, but there's a play you run where you literally have three players stood on one side. Pascal brings the ball up and Fred VanVleet goes screens. I love that play. So there's like good stuff scattered in there, but I just find myself watching it like I want more. But it brings up the question, how important is a roll man? Every team needs one because if you get that rim pressure, that's how you set up things like Veer. But there's definitely more the Raptors could do. But like, I guess it's a question for you. Like, from that creativity perspective, do you put it on the staff? Like, is that something Raptors fans kind of say, "Oh, Nurse needs to do more," or is it a roster thing?
So that's really interesting that you bring that up and you get to the heart of something, because there are people like myself who have lamented the amount of pick and roll, for example, that Pascal Siakam has been able to run. And there's a fine question that you could answer back with like, oh, does Pascal not want to run pick and roll, or is Nick Nurse not giving him enough pick and roll to run? And, kind of, those two battling ideas. But Pascal ran a lot of pick and roll in this most recent playoff series, and it went really well. Another thing is that some people have been noticing, and I love the part about doing this series is that some people like yourself get to the heart of the issue after watching, a few games or being from the outside looking in, right? And you said, what about a roller? And that is such a great question when you consider these Raptors, because they don't have a roller. Thaddeus Young has had a lot of success as like a short roll king when we think back to those Bulls teams where Thagic, the Thagic stuff started coming along. And Boucher has some pop as an all the way to the bucket guy. Precious Achiuwa is really athletic and has pop too, but he doesn't have the pacing or the intention to maintain passing windows and all that kind of stuff. They don't have any roll gravity. Rarely can they ever get a tag. they cannot collapse the weak side. So the playmaking gets stagnated in a lot of ways, and they have to reset and then work into the bully drives and stuff like that for a Scotty or a Pascal, maybe even an OG. They're very limited by the lack of a roller. I'm very glad you picked up on that. Does that mean that the staff has to find a way to make it work without a roller? I think that there's some, we talked about this with Caitlin Cooper about trying to imagine some new stuff they can do offensively, especially around their post-ups. But I think that there's meat on the bone as far as how they can scheme. But I also think you bring up one of the, man, this is at the heart of their half-court issues, the lack of a roller. Koloko, you know, there's film of Fred VanVleet saying, wow, I haven't had that in a long time after throwing a lob to Koloko at a Rico Hines run. There's, you know, he was, I think largely the consensus was that he struggled immensely at Summer League. Some of the Rico clips, he looks good. Me personally, I don't like doing the offseason tape analysis thing, so I need to see Koloko in preseason and then in the regular season before I say, hey, the role problem is solved. Because I talked to Zach Milner, who we both know, who watched like 92 Arizona games of Koloko, and he said rolling isn't a strength. So we're going to see what happens with that, but you bring up one of the biggest issues for sure. Very, very insightful.
So one of the things I kind of thought about with the Raptors, because it doesn't look like you're going to get a roll man in, and then I don't know who's available, and I don't know if Nurse will play them anyway. But I thought, like, in terms of getting some movement in the paint before the screen, so I thought about maybe 3 actions came to mind: Chin, Ram, and Spain. Those are the ones that all came to mind because they're not perfect, but at least you get some kind of defensive movement. Because, like, the thing for me is the better your offense personnel is, the more simple your offense can be. You know, like the Hawks, they don't run anything special. They just run a high pick and roll with Trey and Capella and shooters, and they were the best offense in the league last year.
Can I tell you an interesting thing? The drag screen with John Collins was the most efficient pick and roll for forever, and the second most efficient pick and roll was the screen with Capella. It's just like you have Trae Young, you have offense. It's crazy.
It's a mastery, and that's like the Raptors have to get more creative than the Hawks do, because like the Hawks, their problem is an offense. Like, let's be real. We can say, oh, it's a bit big. That's not why they're not going to achieve their goals. But the Raptors, like, I think there's definitely things that can be done. Like, I thought about delay at first, but then, like, most of the counters out of delay, you need a roll man really at the top of it. So, but they need to use Pascal as a screener more. I don't really quite understand why you don't. To be honest, I think
they like having him as the release valve and not waiting on, like, because if you're the screener, teams can overload sometimes. If you find time, there's a game around the start of January, I believe, against the Clippers where they spammed a Fred on ball Pascal screening pick and roll to win the game. And it was just because they were getting that switch, but it was, you know, screening to switch rather than screening to get downhill, catch on the short roll, stuff like that. But you're completely right. Pascal's skill set, he should be able to eat alive on the short roll, basically.
One of the things I'd like to see the Raptors do as well with Siakam, that I think the Warriors do really well, is they use their bigs as screeners to it's almost like a fake screen, essentially, where you're kind of, because I felt the Raptors offense, though we've spoken about his defense, like the Raptors offense was better, I thought, when Gary Trent was in the game, because at least there was some form of action being run, even if it definitely wasn't coming from the coaching staff. There were a lot of, like, one of the things I noticed is some of your big men would like set like de facto veer screens at times. And that's because Trent was in the game and you want to free him up. But like, I like the idea of using Siakam as a screener in those off-ball actions because you can get him rolling to the rim. You can I spoke about that wedge play earlier, which I will send to you after this as the Wolves run. You could run that with Pascal for sure. Like, you know, you can get him to the low block, sort of out of the disguise of something else. I think that's something the Raptors can do a little bit more of, because to me, it just seemed a bit like they were kind of accepting that they don't have the right personnel. That's the vibe I got when I watched the tape. It was just like, oh, we don't have a roll man, so this is it. And it's like, I get that, but at the same time, like, there's definitely stuff they can do, I think.
And additionally is is Fred equipped to be the decision maker? Because Gary Trent definitely isn't. OG Anunoby is a guy who I think is really great passing on the move and really great making those interior, laydowns and stuff like that, those passes. But Scotty and Pascal are the guys who could make the pass to the roller, but are also the guys who should be the roller. And you talked about chin. The Raptors have Horn's chin punch, which is basically, they actually ran it a little bit with Precious and had some success. So good for Precious there. But Pascal and Scotty, they're alternating between being the passer and also being the guy who's kind of trudging into the paint to kind of blow things up in there. So it's a very fragile offensive ecosystem. And like you said, Gary Trent, just because he's a shooter, can make it work. But I think that's a great place to leave off as far as Raptors, Wolves. Is there anything regarding either team that you'd like to sign off with so that the listener knows maybe this extra nugget of info?
No, not off the top of my head. The only thing I forgot to bring up earlier is because I was going to bring up football as well. When I look at like defensive versatility, I think teams should use drop defense. So like teams that press and gegen press in football, they will have rest periods where they don't press because you can't press for 90 minutes. Your players are all gonna, they're all gonna be on oxygen masks by 10 games into the season. So I think you can use drop coverage as that kind of rest period where you kind of go, we're not going to have you running around the court blitzing and hedging and trapping and having to make all these X outs. Just run a little bit of drop coverage, almost to, not that it's easy, but it's easier than flying about, in my opinion. So that's just something I wanted to bring up. I think that's something that I would say Finch will probably do more this year with Rudy Gobert because Cat is not a drop big at all. He just struggles with the angles. He always has. He probably always will. But I think that was the only other thing I really want to bring up. It's like you can use drop is extremely valuable because you can use it for that purpose as well.
That's bang on. We're completely agreed on drop. Joe, I think we're agreed on this being a great episode. But before we get out of here, man, plug yourself. Tell the people where to find you, what your plans are for this upcoming season, all that good stuff.
Yes, my at is Joe Hulbert NBA. I'm going to be covering the Wolves, possibly another team as well, but kind of waiting and seeing on that. I think mainly I do a lot of video breakdowns where I try and break down some complex concepts and so everyone can understand them. And ultimately, as I always say, the naming of the plays isn't what matters. What matters is that you can tell why it's working and tell that story.
Picking up advantage is more important than knowing play types. But knowing play types, if you're a guy like Bowser to Bowser or you're a coach, it helps, I guess, communicate things in that realm. But if you're a basketball fan and you notice what's creating advantage, it's not important that you know what it's called. It's just important that you notice it. So, Joe, thank you very much for coming on, man. It's been an absolute pleasure.
No problem. Thank you for having me on.
Yeah, man. And listener, viewer, whichever it is, if you're on YouTube, I guess like the video. That helps. If you're on the podcast channel, enjoy the rest of your day. We're going to get out of here. More of these episodes coming soon. Hope you enjoyed this one. Learned a lot about the Wolves, maybe something about the Raptors as well. So take care out there, and we'll see you.